Okay, we're going to get started here in just a moment. Come back here. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to talk about the origins of the Cold War. This is from Chapter 12, Lesson 1, and these are our page numbers in our textbook. So you'll notice here I have this is the flag of the Soviet Union with the kind of communist symbol of the hammer and sickle and the color red, right? When you talk about communists, sometimes they're called Reds. And over here we have the American flag, right? So the Cold War is really the conflict between these two countries that developed in the years after World War II. So we're going to start with looking at, move this out of the way here. We're going to start looking at the kind of new kind of world that FDR and the Allies wanted to create, right? Prior to World War II, the United States was isolationist, and FDR believed that was a mistake, so he did not want to return to isolationism. But also, he didn't trust the Soviet Union. He felt the Soviet Union was looking to try and expand and try and grow its power. So he wanted to make sure that the world was set up in a way that kind of favored the United States, democracy, freedom, those kinds of ideas. Kind of similar to how Woodrow Wilson did after World War I. So there's a conference called the Bretton Conference, and that was to kind of stabilize the world economy, right? The different currencies, the money, paper money in the world, was not necessarily stable because Europe had been kind of basically flattened by a lot of the war in World War II. And the United States was one of the few strong countries left. So they're trying to make sure that the world's economies could be stable so that trade could occur and economies could develop. So at this Bretton Woods conference, they organized the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These are two international organizations that were set up to help kind of rebuild Europe and also to help other economies that were still developing in Asia, Africa, South America, those kinds of places. Oops. And so these would provide loans to countries. They would provide kind of stability with the currencies in the world and make it so that the goods could flow around the world and make it easier to trade. In addition to that, later on, you had the formation of the United Nations. This was replacing the old League of Nations. Remember, the United States never belonged to the League of Nations, but the United Nations was set up, and the United States did belong to this, and it was designed to be a place where countries could get together and talk out their differences. And so you had a General Assembly that all the countries could belong to. It was a place for them to talk to each other and discuss their problems, try and solve their problems. And then there was a Security Council. Security Council is kind of like a much smaller group. There's, I think, 11 countries on it total. And 5 of the countries would be the United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. And remember, all 5 of these countries were the ones that fought against the Axis powers in World War II. So they fought against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And they had veto power. That means that when you veto something that you can reject, you can say, nope, I'm not going to do that, right? So these 5 countries had that veto power. So it gave them a lot more power in the United Nations. And notice how these were, all allies in World War II. So the United Nations was designed to kind of preserve that peace. All right, so now we have another meeting here called the Yalta Conference, where we have the big 3, Franklin Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And they kind of met to kind of plan out, because they were the winners in the war. So they were kind of meeting to plan out, what was this new world going to look like? And we see a picture of them here. See Stalin over here on the right, FDR in the middle, and Churchill on the left here. And at this Yalta Conference, they discussed kind of their plans. And the Soviet Union had occupied Poland. The Soviet Union had occupied Poland. And because Poland was kind of between Germany and the Soviet Union, and Stalin was afraid that he didn't want a repeat where he would be invaded again like he was during World War II. And he noted that, every time Germany tried to invade the Soviet Union, it came through Poland. So he wanted to kind of create this kind of buffer zone between his country and Germany so that he wouldn't have a repeat of World War II. So he wanted to have a friendly government in Poland. So that became communist. And Stalin promised that he would hold elections, later, because that's democracy, right? And later on in Eastern Europe. And this is going to be important because this promise never gets fulfilled. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. They also divided up Germany and Berlin between the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. And we see in this map here, there's a Soviet zone, British zone, American zone, the French zone, these kind of places. And Berlin, which is right here, was the capital of Germany, and that's within the Soviet zone. So what they did was they took the capital and they also divided that, like you see. So you have like this little island of an American, British, and French zone of Berlin inside this larger Soviet zone. And that's going to be important later on. So when Stalin promised to hold free elections in Eastern Europe, he never did, right? And this created tension because one of the things that FDR wanted to promote was democracy, right? Because the United States and Britain were democracies. And so he wanted to promote that around the world. So when Stalin didn't allow those free elections, it created tension and highlighted the differences between the communist style of leadership and kind of the democratic style of leadership of the United States and Britain. All right, so FDR dies shortly after Yalta, and his vice president, Harry Truman, kind of becomes president. Truman didn't have a lot of experience in foreign policy, and so he wanted to be kind of stand up to Stalin and be aggressive because many Americans saw the Soviet Union as kind of a threat. They called Stalin Uncle Joe, and not like in a friendly way. So Truman thought he would try and stand up to Stalin by demanding that they hold elections in Poland. And of course, that never happens, but he wants to kind of take that stand. So there's this meeting called the Potsdam Conference. This is kind of like Yalta, but now with Truman instead of FDR. And the Soviets wanted reparations. Remember, reparations are money that you pay back for damage that you've caused, right? Because the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany. It was a very costly war for them. The Soviet Union lost more soldiers than any other country in the war. And so they wanted Germany to pay for that. But the problem was, if you remember back after World War I, when Germany had to pay reparations, that's one of the things that caused World War II was Germany's inability to pay those reparations allowed for the rise of Hitler, and that they didn't want to repeat that again. And so the United States says, no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to do that, make that same mistake again. And Stalin feels like that's not fair because the Soviet Union, lost more soldiers than anybody else. It was very costly for them. They did a lot of really important work in World War II by coming in from the east all the way to Berlin and without much help. So he felt like that wasn't being fair. And so what ends up happening is the Soviet army had occupied Eastern Europe because remember, Soviet Union is over here. It's a little hard to see because it's red, but right here. And as they marched to Germany, they crossed through all this territory in Eastern Europe here. And so their armies were occupying these places as they marched to Berlin to end World War II. And after the war, they kind of stayed there. And again, so Stalin had promised to hold free elections in these places so these places could elect new governments. And the hope was that from the United States perspective that they would elect democratic governments. But Stalin was kind of afraid of that because, again, he wanted this kind of protection. He didn't want Germany to grow powerful again and invade the Soviet Union and repeat what had happened in World War II. So he liked having control of these places because they were like what he called a buffer zone. And so he was kind of reluctant to hold these elections just in case they went democratic and they became more closely allied with the western part of Europe and the United States. So he wanted to keep them under his influence. And so when these elections were not held in Eastern Europe, it kind of created that tension with the United States because they felt like Stalin was kind of breaking his promise. And like they kind of highlighted the kind of trust issues that FDR and others had with Stalin. So eventually these Eastern European countries became these communist, what are called satellite nations. So think like a satellite that orbits around the Earth, like the moon is a satellite, like it's kind of tethered to the United States, to the Earth, right, in that orbit. So a satellite country is kind of like under that control of. So even though the Soviet Union wasn't directly in charge, these countries had their own governments, but they listened to the Soviet Union. They did what the Soviet Union wanted. They were communists like the Soviet Union. They followed the Soviet Union's kind of directive. They were kind of under their control, right, without being directly controlled by them. And so Winston Churchill, he makes a speech that becomes very famous. He makes a speech actually in Missouri, which is the same state that Truman was from. So Churchill is visiting from England. He makes this speech where he says that an iron curtain has descended across Europe, and we see this divide here. the blue being all the democracies and kind of countries that are more allied with the United States, and the red being the communist countries that were allied with the Soviet Union. So we see this kind of clear divide between Europe. And it's called an Iron Curtain because, you can't see behind it because, Stalin and the communists were very kind of secretive, and they didn't let people travel freely from one place to another. So it was kind of like this, like imagine a curtain that you can't see through and you can't break through. So that's why it's called the Iron Curtain. All right, so a few terms that we've talked about here that you should know. You should know what the UN Security Council is. It's 11 countries in the United Nations, and 5 of them are these allied countries: U.S., Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union. And they each had veto power, which gives them a lot of power in the United Nations. They can reject things that they don't like. And so if any one does that, then nothing happens. Then the thing doesn't happen, right? So not all 5, but only one. Okay. So this kind of begins this time period after World War II, kind of begins this Cold War, this kind of rise of competition and tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Lasts almost 50 years, but it really starts to develop after World War II in terms of what should be done about Europe and what should be done about Germany and that sort of thing. Stalin wants to protect the Soviet Union from potential invasion. The United States wants more freedom and democracy in Europe. And then the term satellite nations. So remember, these are independent countries, but they are kind of like in the orbit of another country. They do what that country says. Okay, so they're not under direct control. They have their own governments, but they fall in line behind the larger country, in this case, the Soviet Union. And then the Iron Curtain. So we talk about this division between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Eastern Europe being communist, Western Europe being democratic. It creates that kind of real clear division between who is on what side during the Cold War. Okay.